Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whatever time you happen to be watching this. I'm thrilled that you've tuned in to watch CRPC's Sunday School, and we are glad that you are staying safe, but at the same time continuing to learn about God's Word. As we make our way through the Hebrew Bible, sort of giving an overview of what each book is about, today we've made our way to the book of Job. The book of Job is for the most part, pretty familiar to people who know about the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and they know about the fact that Job suffered some serious kinds of problems. And so we want to talk about that today. We want to talk about what we can learn from Job, and we want to pay special attention to what's going on in this book. Job is an unusual book. It's a strange book for a variety of reasons, not the least of which that at the beginning of the book there seems to be this conversation between God and the Satan, and they're arguing about whether or not Job is really a righteous man. The book may be one of the earliest books written. It's a very early book, regardless of whether it's the earliest or not. It's a very early book. And the book almost seems to be, and this is an inelegant way to put it, but it almost seems to be a wager between God and Satan. God says to Satan, "Have you seen my servant Job? He is righteous." And Satan says to God, "I bet you that I can make him unrighteous." And so God says, "I'll tell you what, you can do anything you want to him except kill him. Everything else is on the table." And that troubles some of us, maybe all of us, that sort of a man's life is in the hands of someone for no other reason than just a sort of cosmic battle. And here we see a picture of Job, and there are a variety of problems that Job has, as you can see. He has boils on his skin that are bound up. But the thing to remember about this picture is that Job is in the hands of God. And that's the encouraging part of this book, that the key word really is God's sovereignty. And this picture tells us that God reigns. The book of Job examines what is perhaps life's most perplexing question, and that is, why do bad things happen to people who seem to be trying to do the right thing? And it introduces us to this man named Job, who lived maybe 4,000 years ago. We don't know for certain. And a sudden series of catastrophes brought by Satan, sort of with God's allowance, sort of come on to Job. And for 35 chapters, Job searches and searches his soul. And he debates with his best friends. And he asks them, what is the reason for this misfortune? What have I done to create this kind of a problem? And his friends and his counselors give him a variety of conventional wisdom. It must be something that you've done wrong, Job, or you must have done something wrong that you've forgotten about. And finally, toward the end of the book, in chapter 41 and 42, finally Job stands before God, and he asks him, "Why? Why are you doing this to me? And why have you done this to me?" And God answers Job in an especially unusual way that we'll get to in a moment. Another question that we can ask is, what is the genre of Job? This is a very perplexing question for many people, and it has been a perplexing question for many years. There are some who argue that this is sort of a lawsuit of Job against God, that Job is bringing charges against God for what has happened to him. I don't think that that's a compelling case. Others argue that this is pure history, that this is exactly what happened. The problem is that Job is written in poetry, and we know that people don't speak in poetry, and so at the very least it's edited to be a different kind of a book. But others argue that this is a parable or a piece of poetry, which is not to deny that a man named Job lived, not to deny that a man named Job faced serious difficulty, but only to say that what we have here is not an exact historical book, and that it doesn't intend to be a historical book, and that the early readers would have recognized that it's not a historical book, but it's wisdom literature. And wisdom literature often is filled with stories and parables and things like that to remind us of what it means for us to be wise. So you can make your own decision about what kind of genre Job is, and you can look at introductions in your study Bibles or commentaries on Job and try to determine for yourself what kind of genre Job is. One of the interesting things that I find is that in many ancient writings, comedies ended with a wedding. And Job ends with this sort of a wedding feast. And so that may be a little tip to us that this is a comedic piece of literature, because comedies start low and move high, realizing, of course, that Job starts low. He gets all these kinds of problems that happen to him. But by the end of the book, he's on an upward trajectory, and God is showing him why he should be trusting him in spite of the difficulties that he faces. Some see Job as a play with teaching implications, because you see, there are things in Job that almost seem to be stage directions. It's like three men come in and speak to Job, and here are their names. And then another counselor comes in and speaks to Job. And so many very evangelical, total Bible-believing Christians would say that Job meant to be a play. And one of the problems that solves for us, if you take that position, is that at the beginning of the book, Job's children die. Then, at the end of the book, Job is given other children. And any of us who have children know that if one of our children died, getting another one is not going to replace the one that died. It's not going to make up for it. Yet, if this is a play, we see then how that could work out and how it's not nearly the problem that it would be if Job were an actual historical event. But you make up those decisions for yourself. I'm just letting you know that this question of genre is a very significant one, and perhaps it's the most significant question in the book of Job. What kind of a book are we reading? What are we paying special attention to? How are we to read these poetic speeches that are given? All of that goes to the genre of the book of Job. Even the most conservative and traditional recent interpreter grant that the speeches of Job and his friends are literary artifice. That is, even if you want to see Job as an absolute historical book, which some do, and that's fine, one has to agree that Job and his counselors don't speak in poetry. And so there's, at the very least, there's a literary artifice there. And once you grant that, then it's not a far step to grant that God is speaking to us in a variety of ways through the book of Job. And we must realize that God speaks to us in parables. Jesus himself speaks to us in parables. So it would be wrong for us to construct arguments that the story of the prodigal son was a historical event, because Jesus doesn't mean for us to take it that way. So we need to read the text of the scripture with the genre that it was created, in the way that it was written, and trying to find out what the original author had to say to us. We don't know who the original author of Job was, but there are tips along the way to tell us what kind of genre we're working in. So let's look at the context of Job. This context, the whole book of Job, narrates God's suffering and conversations between Job and his friends and God, and even his wife, who is not very kind to him. And this was written by an anonymous author. We don't know who it was. At an unknown date. We don't know when it was written. And it was at least prior to the 6th century BC. So at the very least, we know that this was a very early piece of literature written by someone who wanted to teach us about the sovereignty of God. And whether this is a play or a parable or a historical event, it teaches us the same thing. That is, that God himself is sovereign. We learn from the beginning of the book that Job comes from the land of Uz. We don't know where that is. You can see on the map here there's a question mark, and that's part of what makes us wonder if this isn't a sort of parable, because we don't know where that land was, or where that city might have been, or where that might have taken place. And as a result of that, we just know that it was some kind of a land or a city in which Job lived. But we don't know exactly when it existed, or where it existed, or what kind of a city it was, or how one got there, or what kind of people lived there. We don't know any of that about this land of Uz. An outline of the book is pretty simple. First, there is this prologue to Job's suffering, where God meets with his divine counsel. There is in ancient Near Eastern literature a very common motif of a God meeting with his divine counsel. And it happens in the Bible as well. It happens in the Psalms. It happens here in Job. God is meeting with his divine counsel, and it's at that point that the accuser comes in and says, Satan is not, or Job is not the person you think he is. And then Job begins his dialogue with his friends about the kind of problems that he's having. He's a rich man, and so he has a great deal of cattle, and he finds out that that has been killed. He has several children, and he finds out that they have been killed. At least he still has his health, until all of a sudden boils begin to come all over his skin, and he's sitting in a garbage heap, scraping the boils with broken pottery. And it's at that point that he gives this discussion, this discourse on wisdom. Then there are monologues from two of Job's friends who are telling him what he's done wrong and why he's in the position that he's in, and all of these kinds of things that happen. Then finally, and this is the real climax of the book, from Job 38 to Job 42. Finally, Job begins to speak to God. And he says to God, "Why are you doing this to me? Why did you kill my children? Why did you kill my cattle? Why did you take away from me everything that you have?" And God has this very intriguing answer for Job. He says, "Job, were you there when I laid the foundation of the earth?" And of course, Job wasn't. He says, "Job, can you pull out the Leviathan out of the ocean with a hook?" The Leviathan is apparently some sort of a sea monster. There have been a variety of different commentators who try to say that the Leviathan is a hippo or a crocodile, but none of those really fit the description that we have in Job. The Leviathan is this most powerful of sea monsters. And so God says to Job, "Can you take a hook and while you're fishing with a pole, pull out the most powerful of all sea monsters?" And of course, Job has to say, "No, I can't." And it's at that point that God says to Job, "Well, when you can do that, when you can tell me that you were there when I laid the foundation of the world, and when you can pull out the Leviathan on a hook, then you come back and ask me the questions. But until then, you need to just trust me, because I'm the one who created the world. I'm the one who made the stars in the sky. I'm the one who made the Leviathan, and I'm the one who ultimately knows what is good for you." Now, there are a couple of questions that we ought to think about here toward the end of the book. Questions that we ought to ask ourselves. One is, does Satan have access to speak to God whenever he wants to? This is the passage from Job. "Now there was a day when the sons of God," so this is the divine counsel, "the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord," that is God. All of these other beings who are sometimes called gods are created by Yahweh. Yahweh is the unique, uncreated species. All of the rest of these beings are created, and they are not like him. So the Trinitarian God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are different. They are the totally unique, uncreated ones. And these sons of God and the Satan that is spoken of here, all were created by God. And one of the things that we should realize is that the term Satan in the Hebrew, Satan is the way it is in the Hebrew, and the way that the text speaks in Job is the Satan, the Satan. So it's the Satan came among them. And there are many who will argue that this is not necessarily the Satan personified that we find in the New Testament. Some will say that this is just a job description, that he is the accuser. It's his job to come in and accuse certain people before God. And so we don't know, because Satan is not a big player in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, there's evil, and there's evil personified, but it's nothing nearly like what we see in the New Testament when Satan himself comes and tempts Jesus, or when Satan is spoken of by the Apostle Paul in Ephesians as the prince of the power of the air, or when Satan is spoken of in the book of Acts as the god of this world. And so we realize that there's a disparity between the Satan, the accuser in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and Satan, the personification of evil in the New Testament. And you can read lots more about that if you like to, just by using Google to look up Satan, or using a dictionary there's a dictionary of demons, deities in the New Testament. And you can look up Satan there, and it will give you a long list of how that all plays out. But we shouldn't think that Satan has absolute access to God. He doesn't. Satan, in this case, could come, if it is the Satan, could come and speak to God, but it may be that this is just an adversary who was part of the divine counsel. So Satan is limited in his power. The Satan of the New Testament can only do what God allows him to do. And even though he's called the God of this world, and even though there are certain passages that seem to indicate that Satan is the top of a hierarchy of evil beings, many of whom have specific areas of the world that they are in charge of, none of them can do anything apart from what God tells them to do. So as we think of these satanic beings, if you will, we must realize that they are all on Yahweh's leash, that they can do nothing apart from Him, and that God can take them for a walk just as you can take your dog for a walk, because they are absolutely and totally under His control. And so what is it that we, when we're faced with trials, like Job was faced with trials, what is it that we should do? We're faced with a lot of trials these days. Health trials, financial trials, racial trials. We live in what is perhaps the strangest time in the history of our country, and this COVID virus is causing people to do and say things that they might not say otherwise. So what should we remember when we're faced with these trials? First of all, you should remember that God is all powerful and that He is able to intervene. If you are facing trials right now, it is not that God couldn't stop them, just as He could have stopped them for Job, but He was working it all out for good, just as He was in the life of Joseph. We should also remember that God is all-knowing. Thus, He knows when He should intervene. He knows the best possible time for intervention. And while we might be tired of waiting for our prayer to be answered, God delivers at the very best time. There was a famous minister once who was walking back and forth quickly in his office, and someone came in and said to him, "What's the matter?" And he said, "I'm in a hurry and God isn't." And sometimes that's all of us. We want God to be like a pizza place and deliver in 30 minutes or less. But that's not the way that God works. He intervenes at the time when it is absolute best. And third, we should remember that since God is all caring, He takes care of us, even when we don't realize it. There are many times when we have faced difficulties that we might not have even been aware of, and yet God took care of us. And we can have great and wonderful knowledge in realizing that God is protecting us and taking care of us, even when we don't realize the sort of things that are happening around us. And so, let us seek to know not only that God is sovereign, but to know the sovereign God. So I hope that this lesson on Job will speak to you, and that you will seek not only to know that God is sovereign, He is all powerful, but to actually know the sovereign God and to trust Him when we face difficulties. Next week, we'll be looking at the book of Psalms, looking at several Psalms. Some of them might be your favorites. Some of them might be unknown to you. But it is the hymn book of ancient Israel, and I hope that you'll join me again next week here at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School. Thanks so much for watching.